Our main story tonight concerns the UK, the #1 study abroad destination for Americans who refuse to learn a new language. It's also, fun fact, where I'm from, and even if I never opened my mouth, I feel like you could still tell. The UK is in the middle of an election right now, which is Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called back in May for some reason in the middle of a torrential downpour.
At a damp Downing Street. With few moves left to play, it was time to roll the dice.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
What are you doing, Rishi? It is pouring rain and you're literally standing in front of the house where you live. Just pop in and grab an umbrella. It frankly says something that a British person trying to reclaim the 4th of July as a day of potential victory is the second weirdest thing about that announcement. This election was something of a surprise, though, and if you're confused how that can be, in Britain, the Prime Minister can call an election whenever they want, as long as there is one every 5 years. Like many things, the way Britain operates is kind of like the US, but whimsically worse. The last election was back in 2019, so Sunak had to call one before the end of this year, but he chose to do so right now, something that even members of his own party were blindsided by, as these reporters pointed out later that same day.
I mean, this morning, amid all the speculation, nobody could really believe it. How's it gone down with his MPs?
Badly.
Yeah. Look, first, I don't want to read too much into this, but the fact that both of them were ostentatiously holding large umbrellas there feels like a pretty clear dig to me. But second, I get why Sunak's colleagues were mad. It must suck to have to suddenly go home and tell your spouse, sorry, love, I know we were supposed to go to Italy next month, but my wet boss gave a speech, and now I have to spend the next 6 weeks running around fighting for my job. Sunak's party, the Conservatives, or Tories, are currently wildly unpopular in Britain. They got trounced earlier this year in local elections and are currently polling around 20 points behind their main rival, the Labour Party, with one projection model suggesting Labour could win around 450 of the 650 parliamentary seats. Some have even said that this election could be an extinction-level event for the Tories. And it's not that they're projecting confidence or competence right now. Nearly 80 Conservative MPs have stepped down ahead of the election, a post-war record, and that is on top of the resignations that have taken place over the last couple of years, including this MP, who admitted to using cocaine, but claimed that he was set up, saying it was very late and he'd been drinking tons of incredibly potent Japanese whiskey. Another who admitted to groping 2 men at a private members' club, and this guy who resigned after he was found to have watched pornography on his phone in the House of Commons. And his excuse for that was genuinely amazing.
The situation was that funnily enough, it was tractors that I was looking at, and so I did get into another website that had a sort of very similar name, and I watched it for a bit, which I shouldn't have done. But my biggest crime, is that on another occasion I went in a second time.
And that was deliberately?
That was deliberate.
That is incredible. Yes, I looked at porn twice, but the first time I was just trying to look at tractors on the internet. That is very much the Japanese whiskey tricks me into doing cocaine of internet porn lies. But what makes it even more unbelievable is, why would anyone need to seek out porn if they're already looking at tractors? You've got everything you need right there, and you don't even have to flip off Safe Search. Why go to the bakery when we've got cake at home? I'm not saying I'd fuck a tractor, I'm saying I would let this tractor fuck me so hard I sprout corn. And on top of all this, Sunak himself seems to be almost trying to lose the election, given one of his new bold campaign ideas is to bring back mandatory national service for 18-year-olds, a plan that drew almost immediate blowback to the point that he felt the need to talk to teens in a way that he hoped they'd understand.
Hi TikTok, sorry to be breaking into your usual politics-free feed, but I'm making a big announcement today and I've been told that a lot of you already have some views on it. So, first thing, no, I'm not sending everyone off to join the army. What I am doing is proposing a bold new model of national service for 18-year-olds. They'll be able to choose to spend 12 months in a full-time military commission or 1 weekend per month volunteering in roles within your local community, like delivering prescriptions and food to elderly people or in search and rescue.
Oh, OK. So it's not bringing back the draft, it's bringing back the draft or forcing teens to do Grubhub for grandmas or search for bodies in the Thames. Just classic things 18-year-olds love to do. To put it mildly, the Tories are in trouble, which is a remarkable downfall for a party that's been in power for the last 14 straight years. This could be a massive couple of weeks for the UK. So given that, tonight, let's look at the UK election. We're going to focus on a few things. Some of the choices on offer, why people are so mad at the Conservatives, and why they are absolutely right to be. And let's start with some of the contenders. There's the Liberal Democrats, the traditionally centrist party. They are unlikely to win overall, and because of that, seem to mainly be focusing on having fun. One Lib Dem official has said, as a smaller party, we have to find a way to break into the news cycle, and that has meant pushing their leader, Ed Davey, to do multiple stupid stunts like going down a water slide, falling off a paddleboard and doing look ma no feet on a bike. He even tried to conduct a policy interview in the weirdest imaginable place.
What about the economy? What are you doing with the economy?
Yeah, we've got to get it growing again, and that'll be helped by cutting the NHS waiting list, also by getting a much better trade deal with Europe, and by investing in the skills of our young people. So, you know, we've got great policies for the economy, including the cost of living!
Look, I'm glad Ed Davey is having fun, but the fact is his party is still going to lose the election! Then there is the much less endearing far-right Reform UK party, the punchable face of which is Nigel Farage. He's been out on the campaign trail running on a hard anti-immigration platform and getting the exact reception that he deserves.
Reform UK's attracted attention with bold promises on reducing legal immigration levels and stopping small boat crossings. For all the support, it seems not everyone's a fan of their approach. Nigel Farage was covered in milkshake on the campaign trail.
Spectacular. Also, just a bonkers use of the passive voice there. Was covered in milkshake? Who threw it exactly? I'll tell you who. The Dairy Queen who made this perfect Fibonacci spiral. Just look at her. You can't erase this icon. Look at those lashes. No need to force the youth into serving their country. This legend is doing it for free. And do you have any idea just how unlikable you have to be to get milkshaked? No one just casually has a milkshake on their person or thinks, I better grab one in case I encounter any arseholes today. No, they think, you know what I haven't had in a while but deserve? A milkshake, a treat. Yet despite that, Nigel Farage is clearly so much of an arsehole that this hero was willing to get rid of her possible birthday milkshake, having decided this is a better use of it. And frankly, she was right, especially as this wasn't even the first time that Farage got milkshaked. It happened to him back in 2019 too. And just look at him. Look how sad he is wearing his stupid little ribbon. He looks like he threw up on himself after winning a spelling bee. And if for even a moment you have the tiniest flicker of sympathy for him, please know that he followed his recent milkshaking by releasing this video.
My milkshake brings all the people to the rally.
I hate that man so much. There is, and I'm not exaggerating, no one on earth more deserving of being milk-shook than Nigel Farage. So clearly, neither of these two wet boys are likely to be the next Prime Minister. But why isn't this one going to win? As Prime Minister, he should have the advantage of incumbency. But the truth is, Sunak's never been popular, and for multiple reasons, including the fact that after marrying the heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune, he's now got more money than the king. In fact, it says something that the very day it was announced that Sunak would become Prime Minister, one news report featured this fun graphic.
Well, how would you describe Rishi Sunak in one word? Savanta Comras, a polling research company, came up with a word cloud and people sent in their thoughts. And this is the conclusion. Rich is the overwhelming word, alongside capable, OK, good and clever.
Wow. Do you know how much of an out-of-touch wang you have to be for people to think that your whole vibe can be summed up by the word rich? Elon Musk is the richest man on Earth, and it's not even the first word that comes to mind when I think of him. That would be apartheid. It's also not the first word that comes to mind when I think of Bill Gates. That would be, how many times was he on Epstein's plane, which counts as one word if you say it really fast. But perhaps the most notable thing there isn't how big the word rich is that that word cloud also includes the words twat and cunt. They put that on the news. Enough people called the Prime Minister a cunt that it made the news. It almost makes me feel patriotic. And just for the record, cunt in the UK isn't as harsh a word as I know it is here. I know that here in the US, it's usually used by red-pilled basement boys toward powerful women. But in the UK, it's a non-gendered, multi-purpose insult, like dodgy, tosser, numpty, wanker, dick splash, fuckletoes, pillock and cockwomble. Only one of those is made up, and it's not the one you think. But Perhaps the clearest sign of how unpopular the Tories are is that they're about to be defeated by the Labour Party, currently led by Keir Starmer. And fun fact about Keir, there aren't any. In fact, when pollsters asked voters to describe what Starmer stands for, the responses included nothing, not sure, and don't know. His most notable attribute may be having no real notable attributes at all, as this pollster delicately points out.
For Keir Starmer, still over half of the population don't really perceive that they know what he stands for, and only 1 in 5 people say that he's good in a crisis or indeed has a personality. And so there are some areas where he needs to see further development.
OK, set aside the brutal personality slam there. You know how hard it is to have less than half the population know what you stand for in the modern age? Thanks to social media, I know what my high school chemistry teacher thinks about vegans who eat honey. I know my brother's roommate's ex-girlfriend thinks Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have acted alone. And I know that Shaq doesn't fit in the seats at Knott's Berry Farm because he tweeted, and I quote, "I'm at Knott's Berry Farms and my butt's too big to fit in the seats on the ride. Ah!" That's me yelling. That was 15 years ago, and it'll be the last thing I think about before I die. The point is, we know too much about everyone on Earth, making it incredible that British people don't seem to know much about the man on the verge of running the 6th largest economy in the world. To the extent we do know anything about Starmer, it's that he's a pretty bland centrist. Perhaps the perfect symbol of that is the fact that he unveiled his party's middle-of-the-road platform earlier this month, standing next to the word change in the smallest font imaginable. He's also done things like tell his cabinet members they should not be on picket lines, showing support for striking rail workers, which is a little hard to take given his party's name is literally Labour. And on a personal level, he's been repeatedly challenged to come up with interesting facts about himself, and so far has only managed to come up with one.
Tell us one interesting or surprising thing about yourself that we don't already know, by the way.
Oh, well, look, I did violin lessons with Fatboy Slim back in the day, and I'm sure some of the things... That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
OK, I will admit, that is definitely notable. Though it's not great when the most interesting thing about you is I was once in school next to someone more interesting. Yeah, Keir, we assumed that. So how are the Conservatives at the point where they're about to have their arses handed to them by Fatboy Slim's violin partner? Well, the answer is everything they've done over the last 14 years, in which time they've had 5 different prime ministers, and it's worth briefly revisiting all of them. Now, let's start with David Cameron, 3-time winner of Britain's least lips. He took over in 2010 at a time when Britain was running record deficits and chose to tackle that through what's been called one of the biggest deficit reduction programmes seen in any advanced economy since World War II. And while much of Europe focused on raising taxes to close budget gaps, Cameron relied heavily on a programme of austerity, essentially making brutal cuts to government services and attributing Britain's struggles not to the 2008 financial crisis, but to years of frivolous spending under Labour. And he explained his cuts like this.
Reducing spending will be difficult. There are programmes that will be cut. There are jobs that will be lost. There are things the government does today that it will have to stop doing. Many government departments will have their budgets cut, on average, by 25% over 4 years.
Now, we will get into the impact those cuts had, but before we do, let's address what might have been the most savage cut of all there, and that is the camera cut from David Cameron to this guy. It is strange to suddenly show this haunted business thumb at all, but especially right after David Cameron said there are things the government needs to stop doing. But maybe it was strategic. Maybe they thought, look, we're cutting programmes. People lose their jobs. So when I say the government is going to stop doing stuff, make sure you cut to Weird Dave. He's so odd-looking, people might think, oh, is that the government? I definitely want him to stop doing everything he's doing immediately. Turn off the lights and put him somewhere damp. He looks like a fan of the damp. But those cuts were brutal. In their first 10 years, central government funding for local authorities fell by as much as 40%. And the way they were structured meant that the most deprived areas had to cut their spending the most. And poor families and kids were hit hardest, as Cameron's measures included reducing housing benefits, cutting grants to pregnant women, and freezing benefits for working-age families, even as inflation was rising. But the move that ultimately doomed Cameron wasn't any of that. It was his decision to appease Eurosceptic members of his party by calling the Brexit vote, a decision one of his own cabinet ministers has called the greatest blunder ever made by a British Prime Minister. And that is including this look. And by the way, Buzz, buzz, bitch, the B-movie called, it's 2007 and you have 6 years left to live. The idea was the Brexit referendum would later rest the question of whether Britain should leave the EU. And the infuriating thing is, Cameron himself didn't support Britain leaving and only called the vote because he thought it would fail. But, of course, it didn't, and he immediately resigned in disgrace, leaving a successor, Theresa May, who had also opposed Brexit, to deal with the mess. She spent 3 years trying to hammer out a Brexit deal while also overseeing yet more austerity measures like the so-called two-child cap, which restricted the child tax credit and other benefits to the first 2 children in most households. So even if you had 5 kids, you only get benefits for 2 of them, which does make sense. Everyone knows that after the 3rd kid, they don't really have to eat. And May wasn't exactly a charismatic leader.
Beyond Westminster, despite her attempts to laugh at herself, Theresa May never really connected with the public.
Public sector working.
She was also weakened by episodes like the party conference speech where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Well, before her decision to step down, critics said the wheels were coming off her leadership.
I gotta say, it's a pretty bad sign when you're literally standing in front of a pretty bad sign. Ultimately, May couldn't hammer out a Brexit deal that her party would support, so she gave way to this fucking guy, whose time in office was a total shambles, because while Boris Johnson did finally get a Brexit deal done and Britain left the EU on January 31st, 2020, that was the exact same day Britain's first cases of the coronavirus were announced. And Boris's handling of COVID was an unmitigated disaster. At first, he reportedly dismissed it as the new swine flu and just a scare story, with one of his advisors saying that he seemed to think COVID is just nature's way of dealing with old people. And one of Boris's top aides, Dominic Cummings, later testified about just how badly the government handled COVID in a hearing featuring readings from messages that he'd sent at the time.
You called ministers useless morons in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues. Do you feel that you expressed your views too trenchantly, that your opinion of ministers and of the cabinet overstated the position?
No, I would say, if anything, it understated the position, as events showed in 2020.
Just to be clear, what was bleeped there was Cummings calling his colleagues useless fuckpigs and cunts. And that is completely unfair. Not the cunt part, that does apply. I'm talking about the term fuckpigs, because for the record, there has only been one actual fuckpig in Downing Street, and that is David Cameron, whose unauthorised biography, lest we forget, told us that as a student at Oxford, he apparently once put his dick in a dead pig's mouth. And the thing is, he probably would have gotten away with that too if someone hadn't squealed. Not the pig, of course. The pig couldn't squeal, it was dead, plus its mouth was full. David Cameron put his dick in a dead pig's mouth. Now, ultimately, Johnson was undone by a series of scandals, including his efforts to cover up parties his government repeatedly held during the pandemic in violation of his own lockdown rules. So, he then gave way to Liz Truss, who had the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister in history. We've talked before about her disastrous proposed budget, full of tax cuts for the rich, which caused a mini economic crisis, and we talked about her weird speaking style. So there's really not much point in even showing you a clip of her, but given how weird she was, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway.
My mother took me on protests. I went on marches. I made banners. I stayed at peace camps.
What is happening there? She speaks like a kindergarten teacher during story time, but with no book, no page-turning, and, crucially, no kindergartners. She's like if Hold for Applause was a person. Anyway, Truss was gone in less than 2 months, which finally brings us back to Sunak the Wet, a man who literally doesn't have the sense to come in from the rain. And look, it's objectively fun to look back at what a collection of weirdos ran Britain for years, but it gets considerably less fun when you look at what they did to the country. And let's start with the most obvious calamity, and that's Brexit. The pitch for it was that it would free British businesses of Europe's onerous restrictions. But instead, what ended up happening was for UK companies looking to trade with Europe, especially small businesses, the red tape has actually multiplied exponentially.
Remember when we were part of the single market, you could throw a box of tea or a packet of bangers into the back of a van in Birmingham and just drive it to Barcelona or Bonn or Brussels without let or hindrance. Now you can't do that.
We were told that we would have the most amazing deal. We're going to get our sovereignty, and we were going to keep all the advantages of being the EU. As a business, we were dumb enough to believe that. Come January last year, we got an order from Italy. We shipped it as normal, thinking there'll be a little bit of paperwork and we'll figure it out. And it sat for 12 weeks in different customs houses. So the reality was very different.
Yeah, that sounds like a total mess, but I just want to go back to that guy naming cities there, because I really did not want him to ever stop. You could throw a box of tea or a packet of bangers into the back of a van in Birmingham and drive it to Barcelona, or Bonn, or Brussels, or Bratislava, or Bern, or Bucharest, or Budapest, or Belfast, or Berlin, or maybe as far away as Bergen or Bilbao, or Brest, or Bologna, or even circle back through Bad Hoeverdorp. You could just drive. The point is, trading goods with the EU is now so onerous, lots of UK businesses, like that woman's, have opted to relocate into mainland Europe, which is not good news for the UK and helps explain why Brexit is estimated to be costing the UK economy about £100 billion per year. But while Brexit's the story that made international news, austerity might be the more insidious legacy of Cameron and his successors, because it has, in so many ways, obliterated the social safety net. Take the NHS, the UK's healthcare system. Years of underinvestment have left it gutted and understaffed. Just watch as the father of one sick child tried unsuccessfully to convey this to Boris Johnson back when he was PM.
There are not enough people on this ward. There are not enough doctors. There are not enough nurses. It's not well organised enough. Right. The NHS has been destroyed. Right. It's been destroyed. It's been destroyed. And now you come here for a press opportunity.
Well, actually, there's no press here.
What do you mean there's no press here? Who are these people?
What an amazing line to even try to get away with. The thing about denying the press is there is the press tends to catch you doing that because the press is fucking there. But that man's anger was fully justified. Wait lists for NHS treatment have exploded. More than 7.5 million people are waiting for non-emergency treatment. That is up from 2 million when Conservatives first took office. It's gone to the point where significant numbers of British people are now going to Europe and paying out of pocket to get treatment. This surgeon in Lithuania apparently has a booming business treating British patients.
Last year, we did about 400 something, 500 maybe surgeries, and about 80% they're from UK. People from the UK comes because of the waiting time. And also excellent quality here, of course.
OK. First, I really don't know what's more surprising there, the cheerful hammering or the fact he's doing it in the middle of an interview. But the fact 80% of his patients are now from the UK is staggering. The only foreigners I expect to be flocking to Lithuania en masse are people from New Jersey wanting to see this actual Tony Soprano statue. This is real. It's in a train station in their capital. Here it is from another angle. The thing is huge. And much like hundreds of British orthopaedic patients, it doesn't make any sense that it's suddenly in Lithuania. But it's not just the NHS. The Tories have literally starved the country. In 2010, the largest network of food banks in Britain operated just 35 nationwide. Today, it runs more than 1,300. And 20% of people referred to their food banks are in working households. Meanwhile, more than 800,000 patients were admitted to hospital with malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies last year, with doctors even seeing cases of scurvy and rickets. And British 5-year-olds are now a full centimetre shorter than they were in 2010. And it is pretty hard for Conservatives to say they're working toward the future growth of Britain when its future generations are quite literally shrinking. The unending parade of austerity cuts has relentlessly harmed the most vulnerable in Britain. Take Alexander Doodle, who has multiple disabilities, including a degenerative condition in their hands and feet. A few years back, they invited a camera crew to see the impact that cuts to things that the government used to provide, like home health aides, prescription drugs and accessible housing, had on them.
It just feels like every area has been infected by cuts. The government changed things on some of your prescription stuff. So at one point I was having to pay for 4 or 5 medications and I'm just not buying them anymore. I can't afford it. Again, because of funding cuts, there's these huge waiting lists for a wheelchair, electric wheelchair, which is kind of fundamental for disabled people to be able to get about. And so then I sold my TV And I had a second-hand laptop that I sold, and I had a little yard sale at the front trying to just sell items and cutlery and plates and stuff, and it was still nowhere near enough.
That is appalling. They're having to sell their fucking forks to survive. And now, when you think back to David Cameron blithely saying, there are things the government does today that it will have to stop doing, it makes me even madder at both him and MP Slenderman here. But that is the natural endpoint of austerity right there, punishing people for circumstances completely beyond their control. And Sunak is now promising to introduce what he calls the next generation of welfare reforms, including yet more cuts, justifying it by saying, I worry very much about benefits becoming a lifestyle choice, which is a rich fucking statement from a rich fucking man who'd probably go into anaphylactic shock if he ever had to fly coach. And the thing is, none of this was inevitable. The Tories will argue that they faced headwinds of financial crises and a pandemic, but other countries had that too, but made different choices. And as a result, on a per-person basis, economic growth has been slower in the UK than in the US and the EU since the 2008 financial crisis. So it is no wonder Britons want a change. And personally, I would want the changes to be a bit more sweeping than some of what Starmer is currently proposing, which includes maintaining Conservative tax and spending plans until growth returns and keeping the two-child benefit cap. That just isn't the kind of bold political courage I would like to see from someone who, remember, took violin lessons with Fatboy Slim. And it does say something that even as Starmer appears poised to sweep into office in a landslide, Britons don't seem that fired up by him.
So if you had to describe Keir's campaign in one word? Dull.
No one really cares, because we all know he's going to win, so he kind of gets a free pass on most stuff.
There seems to be a lot of shrugs going on at the moment, but maybe that's just where we are as a country.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that is true, but after everything you've seen tonight, you can probably understand why people are much more concerned about who's leaving than who is coming next. If a wild badger broke into your home and fucked everything up for 14 years straight, tearing absolutely everything apart, you might think, well, you know what? We'll argue about redecorating choices later. Right now, that badger's gotta fucking go. And I will say, if the UK can successfully rid itself of the Tories next month, that is not a cause for a shrug. That's a cause for a celebration. And I know that celebration is not something that necessarily comes naturally to Britons. The country's most famous motivational slogan is keep calm and carry on. And even that morale booster basically amounted to, I know you're about to die, but there's no need to make a scene. That was supposed to get us through World War II. But if Britain can extricate itself from the party whose unremitting cruelty has stained the last decade and a half of British life, that does deserve to be marked. And I know dancing in the street doesn't really fit with the British character, so instead, why not celebrate what's hopefully about to happen with the single most British symbol imaginable, a rainstorm? Because on July 4th, Britain has a chance to wash itself clean of 14 miserable years of Conservative rule, and it's a chance it simply must take. If I may quote Bill Pullman yelling about aliens, if we do this, the 4th of July will no longer be known as just an American holiday, but also as the day when Britain looked at the Conservatives who've driven the entire country into a ditch and said in one voice, loud and clear, fuck off into the sun, you cunts, fuck pigs and weirdos. You tossers, wankers, dick splashes and cockwombles. If Britain stands together this July the 4th, it will finally celebrate its Independence Day. That is our show. Thank you so much for watching. We're off for the next few weeks. Back July 21st. Good night. Give us freedom.